Greetings, YouTube. Today I'm going to review Fly. The Unsung Hero of 20th Century Science by Martin Brookes. This is a book about the fruit fly. It's not a particular big book, appropriate seeing as the fruit fly isn't particularly large either. And this deals with the entire history of the fruit fly's use in science to study genetics, from when it was first introduced at the end of the 19th century, all the way up through its the full sequencing of its DNA that was done at the end of the last century, the 20th century, and of course it's still being used today. But the bulk of the great breakthroughs that were made involving the fruit fly were in the 20th century. And the author is Martin Brookes, and he is a biologist, and he did not study fruit flies when he was in school, his college. He actually studied moths. Apparently the fruit fly programs are all full. He went to South Wales and plotted moths and discovered that they have a range measured in about 20 meters. Their entire lives are at about a 20-meter zone. Sounds really boring, but maybe that's why I'm not in biology. But I am fascinated by biology, in particular evolutionary theory. And this is a really thorough but not overly academic history of the fruit fly. It's a very conversational tone. Most of the chapters open up with some kind of fairly fanciful intro where he's postulating, with what could have happened or what did happen, or the world from the point of view of a fly, things like that. But he covers all the main researchers, almost exclusively white guys. There are a few women in there, but mostly it was white guys. And I was pleased to see that I actually recognized some of the names, like Dobzhansky, who was a famous European, Russian researcher from something else I had read. I can't remember what. I've read a number of books on evolutionary theory over the years. But it was really a fun read, from how the fruit flies were first used simply because they were convenient, and then because they have such short lifespans. I mean, the entire lifespan of a fruit fly in captivity is 40 to 50 days for the most part. Because that you have multiple generations in a year, and it's really useful for trying different experiments. And initially, of course, they had to look for mutations that were available just as chance, because they had no way of making their own. Eventually, they were able to use radioactive isotopes, which is a fairly dangerous method of creating mutations. But because of that, it let them begin to understand how the genes functioned. Eventually, they were able to use chemical mutagens, and that led them to be able to have mutations on demand. They just gave these chemicals to the flies. They would see what would happen. They would isolate the interesting mutations. Some of them were more obvious to others, color and leg or wing deformities, things like that. But then there were more subtle ones, like behavioral problems. They had this one which is like it walks in circles. And it just keeps walking in circles until eventually it stops in the center of its little dish where it dies. There were mutations that killed the fly almost as soon as they were hatched from their grub stage. There are mutations that, for example, one which I thought was terrifying. They were actually able to introduce a mutation in a fly strain that caused it to stop evolving. That just terrifies me. That you can turn off evolution in something. That's scary. But they did this because they were trying to discover whether or not fruit fly seminal fluid, yes, the fluid that is helping to carry semen along, is detrimental to female fruit flies. And it is. And in fact, there is an evolutionary race between the females having resistance to these seminal fluids and the males coming up with better seminal fluids so that they can then use these seminal fluids in a number of different methods to control the paternity of the offspring, hopefully increasing their chances of being the fathers of those future fruit flies. And so they turned off the genes in this one particular strain, discovered that when the females could not defend themselves, the male's seminal fluid kept getting stronger and stronger and stronger because it had nothing competing against it. And the females, their lifespans were being shortened further and further and further down. It was kind of terrifying. The only part of this book where I had any contention with the author, he discusses Dobzhansky's definition of species. And this is the most common definition of species I've ever heard. Hank Green did a video about it quite recently. And I recommend seeing Hank Green's science videos. They're very good. And basically it's if two creatures can have fertile offspring, they are considered to be a species. So if, for example, male lions and female tigers can have ligers, which are very large, larger than their parents, but ligers are sterile. So lions and tigers are separate species. They cannot produce fertile offspring. Well, Mr. Brookes here points out that 10% of the animal species in the world actually can produce fertile offspring. And his position is that this is proof that there is a hole in Dobzhansky's definition of what a species is. And my thought is, turn that around. Maybe that's a hole in how we define species, in the sense that we think there are animals in the world that are separate species because they look different, that are in fact the same species because they can produce fertile offspring. I mean, look at a Chihuahua and a Great Dane. They do not look like the same species. And yet, if you were to breed them, you'll have viable offspring. It's like looking at a tiger and one of my cats. All right? They do not look like the same species, and they aren't. Yet, a Chihuahua and a Great Dane are. So I think there may be a situation where 10% of the species in the world are being misidentified as being separate species when they are in fact the same species with a lot of different variations within that species. I could be crazy, I'm not a biologist, but that seemed to be a really big gaping hole in his argument against the definition of species, which has stood up so well over the years and is accepted by so many people. I don't know. But if you like biology and you have any interest in insects, and you don't want a huge book that isn't going to swamp you with a lot of technical terms, this is definitely something I recommend. In fact, I'm going to go give it to someone today who I think might enjoy it. A fellow person that actually enjoys nonfiction. There are so few of us out there. So I recommend this book. Go read it. It's cool, and it will make fruit flies a whole lot more interesting than you probably think they are.